There is a kind of quiet that is learned, not chosen. It forms slowly in rooms where speaking felt risky, where being noticed came with consequences. This quiet does not look like fear. It looks like politeness, like thoughtfulness, like someone who listens well and asks for little. Over time, silence becomes a language of belonging, a way to stay included without disturbing the emotional balance of others. Words are weighed, reactions are softened, needs are delayed, and eventually quiet stops being something a person does. It becomes who they are. This is the psychology of people who learn to stay quiet to be accepted, not because they had nothing to say, but because saying less once felt safer than saying too much. There is often a moment that goes unnoticed. Not dramatic, not loud, just a small internal shift. A child speaks and something in the room tightens. A look changes. A tone cools. Attention withdraws. Nothing is said outright. No rule is announced. But the message is absorbed quietly. This is not welcome. And so the first silence is born. It does not arrive as fear. It arrives as awareness, a growing sensitivity to atmosphere, to emotional weather. The child begins to sense when words land softly and when they do not, when presence is tolerated and when it disrupts. At first, the silence is temporary, a pause before speaking, a hesitation, a recalculation. But over time, it becomes patterned. The child notices that being quieter brings fewer consequences, that listening earns approval, that staying out of the way keeps relationships stable. Acceptance, it seems, is not about being known. It is about being manageable. This is not conscious strategy. It is emotional learning. The nervous system records these moments without language. It remembers what happens when expression leads to discomfort, either in others or within the self, and it adapts. Quiet becomes regulation. In environments where emotions are unpredictable, silence feels grounding. In spaces where attention is conditional, quiet feels respectful. In families where feelings are dismissed or minimized, silence feels mature. And slowly the child stops testing the edges of expression, not because curiosity fades, but because safety becomes more valuable than authenticity. The first silence is often praised. Adults call it well-behaved. Teachers call it easy. Peers may call it nice. The child learns that quietness is not only safe, it is rewarded. But beneath this external validation, something subtle is happening. The internal world remains rich, complex, observant. Thoughts continue to form. Emotions still move through the body. They are simply no longer given a path outward. Instead, they turn inward. They are processed alone, sorted quietly, contained. This containment creates an early form of self-sufficiency. The child learns not to rely on others to hold their emotional experience. They become skilled at managing themselves. From the outside, this looks like maturity. From the inside, it feels like responsibility that arrived too early. The first silence is not a shutdown. It is a narrowing of expression to preserve connection, a narrowing of voice to maintain belonging. Over time, this narrowing becomes automatic. The body learns to pause before speaking. The mind learns to scan before sharing. The heart learns to soften its edges before being seen. What is lost is not voice itself, but spontaneity. Expression becomes filtered, carefully shaped, adjusted to fit the emotional capacity of the room. This is how silence stops being situational. It becomes relational. The individual learns who they are allowed to be with others, and that version is quieter, smaller, easier to accept. Importantly, this quiet does not mean absence of depth. Often it is the opposite. These individuals feel deeply. They notice subtleties others miss. They are attuned, perceptive, emotionally intelligent, but they carry this depth privately, because early on they learned that depth, when expressed freely, could overwhelm, inconvenience, or disappoint. So they learned to hold it alone. The first silence, then, is an act of care. Care for relationships, care for stability, care for acceptance. It is not weakness. It is adaptation. But adaptations, when carried too long, begin to define identity. What begins as a moment of restraint slowly becomes a way of being, and long before the individual realizes it, quiet is no longer something they choose. It is something they default to. The first silence teaches a powerful lesson. Belonging can be maintained by being less visible, and once that lesson is learned, it is rarely questioned, only repeated. Quiet does not emerge in isolation. It is shaped by context, by patterns that repeat, by emotional climates that teach a person how much of themselves is welcome. For many, the origin of learned silence lives in early relationships, not always in obvious harm, more often in subtle imbalance. In homes where emotions were unpredictable, children learned to monitor rather than express. They watched carefully, listened for shifts in tone, learned which moods were safe and which were not. Expression became a risk calculation. If a parent was easily overwhelmed, the child learned to simplify themselves. If anger arrived suddenly, the child learned to stay neutral. If love felt conditional, the child learned to perform emotional restraint. Silence became a way to stabilize the environment. In other families, comparison played a quiet role. One child was louder, another more praised, another more demanding. The quiet child learned that attention was scarce, that drawing notice required competition, and so they stepped back. Not because they lacked needs, but because stepping forward felt costly. Sometimes silence grew in households where achievement mattered more than emotion, where feelings were acknowledged only when they were impressive, useful, or well-managed. Here, expression was permitted, but only within narrow limits. Sadness needed to be brief. Joy needed to be appropriate. Anger needed to be justified. Anything messy or inconvenient was gently redirected, minimized, or ignored. The child learned to translate emotional experience into acceptable forms, and anything that could not be translated was kept private. In these environments, quiet became sophistication. It looked like control, like emotional intelligence, like strength. But beneath that appearance, the child was learning an important association. Connection requires self-editing. In some cases, silence developed as a response to neglect rather than intensity. When emotional bids were met with absence, the child stopped bidding. Why speak if no one is listening? Why explain if no one responds? Over time, the child learned to be self-contained. Needs were lowered, expectations adjusted. This quiet was not about fear of reaction. It was about fear of futility. Silence protected against disappointment. In social environments, the pattern continued. Classrooms rewarded compliance. Friendships rewarded agreeableness. Group dynamics favored those who did not disrupt flow. The quiet child became adaptable. They learned to fit in anywhere by taking up less space. They became good at observing group rules that were never spoken, good at sensing when to speak and when to disappear. What no one noticed was the cost of this adaptability. Each time the child chose silence over expression, the body recorded it. The nervous system learned that restraint led to safety. That expression led to uncertainty. These lessons compounded. By adolescence, silence often felt natural, even virtuous. The individual might be described as thoughtful, reserved, easygoing, rarely demanding, rarely dramatic, but inside a different reality formed. Thoughts piled up without release. Emotions circulated internally without reflection. The self became something to manage rather than share. Importantly, this pattern was not born from lack of desire for connection. It was born from a deep longing for it. Silence was an attempt to preserve closeness, to stay included, to remain emotionally relevant without being emotionally disruptive. The child learned that presence could be maintained through accommodation, through flexibility, through self-suppression, and so quiet became love, not the expressive kind, but the careful kind, the kind that watches first, adjusts second, and speaks last if at all. By the time adulthood arrives, the origin of this silence is often forgotten. It no longer feels like a response. It feels like personality, but the roots remain. In every moment of hesitation, in every unsent thought, in every feeling that is softened before being shared, silence learned early becomes the language of belonging, a language spoken fluently, even when it begins to cost more than it gives. What begins as adaptation slowly becomes architecture, not just emotional behavior but internal structure. Silence, when repeated, reshapes the nervous system. Psychologically, this pattern is known as emotional inhibition, the consistent suppression of expression in response to perceived relational risk. But lived experience is quieter than clinical language suggests. It feels like pausing before speaking, like rehearsing internally, like deciding something is not worth saying. Over time, the brain learns this sequence well. Thought arises, evaluation follows, expression is delayed or abandoned. This loop becomes automatic. The prefrontal cortex steps in quickly, filtering impulse through safety. The amygdala, having learned that expression can threaten connection, stays alert. The body subtly tightens. Not enough to feel like fear, enough to feel like restraint. This is not a lack of emotion. It is an abundance of caution. The individual becomes skilled at emotional self-regulation, but at a cost. Regulation turns into suppression when expression is consistently denied a path outward. Psychologists describe this as internalization. Emotions are experienced fully but processed privately, without interpersonal feedback. Without co-regulation, the nervous system learns to do everything alone. At first, this creates competence. The person appears calm under pressure, stable, reliable, but suppression requires energy. Each unspoken feeling must be contained. Each withheld reaction must be managed internally. Over time, this creates cognitive and emotional load. Mental fatigue sets in without clear cause. Emotional numbness appears not because feeling is gone, but because it has been held too long. The mind adapts by dulling intensity. This is why many quiet individuals describe feeling disconnected from their own emotions, not absent, muted. The psychology behind this is protective. The nervous system, overwhelmed by unexpressed material, reduces sensitivity to maintain function. This is not dysfunction. It is survival efficiency. Another layer emerges: people-pleasing. When acceptance depends on self-restraint, the individual learns to prioritize external harmony over internal truth. They become attuned to others' needs, moods, and expectations. This attunement is not manipulative. It is defensive empathy. By anticipating others, they reduce risk. By adjusting themselves, they preserve belonging. But this creates an asymmetry. Others are felt clearly. The self becomes blurred. Over time, identity becomes externally referenced. Worth is measured by ease, by how little disruption one causes. Silence reinforces this loop. Each time expression is withheld and connection remains intact, the behavior is rewarded. The brain registers success. Each time expression is attempted and tension follows, even subtly, the brain registers threat. Learning happens below awareness. Eventually, the body responds before the mind decides. The throat tightens before words form. The impulse to speak fades before it reaches consciousness. This is conditioned inhibition. Importantly, this pattern does not erase desire for expression. It redirects it. Thoughts become internal monologues. Emotions become private narratives. Creativity becomes introspective. Many quiet individuals have rich inner worlds, complex imaginations, deep emotional intelligence, but the bridge between inner and outer narrows. Without expression, emotions lack relational grounding. They are not mirrored, validated, or contextualized. They remain unresolved. This is where internal conflict begins to form. The psyche holds two truths at once: a need to be known, and a learned belief that being known threatens acceptance. This contradiction creates tension, not loud, persistent. It shows up as hesitation in conversations, as regret after staying silent, as a sense of invisibility even when present. The psychology of suppression is not about weakness. It is about intelligence applied too early, in environments that required it. The system worked. That is why it stayed. But what was once adaptive begins to limit. Silence protects connection, but it also prevents depth. It keeps relationships smooth but shallow, stable but distant. And eventually, the individual begins to feel something they cannot name at first: a quiet longing, not to be louder, but to be real. Silence, when held for too long, begins to create pressure, not outwardly, internally. The individual moves through life appearing composed, thoughtful, agreeable. But beneath this surface, a tension grows. Slow, persistent, unnamed. It is the tension between inner experience and outer presentation. Inside, thoughts form with clarity. Emotions arrive with depth. Reactions are felt fully. Outside, very little changes. Words are filtered. Feelings are softened. Responses are edited to maintain emotional safety. This divide becomes exhausting. The psyche is not designed to carry experience alone indefinitely. Human emotion seeks reflection. It wants to be seen, shaped, understood in relation to others. When this does not happen, experience turns inward. The individual begins to live two lives. One internal, rich, complex, emotionally alive. One external, contained, polite, minimal. The distance between these two selves creates conflict. Not dramatic conflict. Quiet resistance. A sense of being unseen even in close relationships. A feeling of loneliness that does not come from lack of people but lack of expression. This loneliness is confusing. From the outside, life appears connected. There are conversations, responsibilities, social presence. But something essential is missing. The self is present but not fully revealed. Over time, this creates a subtle form of grief, not for what happened but for what never gets to exist out loud. The individual may resist this awareness. After all, silence has kept them safe. It has preserved relationships. It has prevented conflict. Questioning it feels dangerous. There is often a fear that expression will lead to rejection, that speaking fully will overwhelm others, that honesty will disrupt the fragile balance that silence maintains. So the conflict stays internal. One part longs to speak freely. Another part tightens control. The body often holds this conflict. Tightness in the throat, shallow breathing, a sense of holding back without knowing what. Emotionally, this can manifest as irritability without cause, emotional numbness, sudden waves of sadness that feel disproportionate. These are not random. They are signals. Signals that something internal wants movement. But resistance remains. The mind reminds the self of past learning, of times expression led to discomfort, of moments when being quieter worked better. The nervous system prefers what is familiar, even when familiar costs something. And so the individual stays silent, even when no one is asking them to. This is where identity becomes entangled with behavior. Quiet is no longer something done. It is something believed. I am not the kind of person who speaks up. I don't want to burden others. It's better this way. These beliefs protect against fear. They also restrict possibility. The inner conflict intensifies. When the individual encounters spaces where expression is invited, where depth is welcomed, where authenticity is safe, instead of relief, discomfort arises. The system does not know how to respond to openness without danger. Vulnerability feels unfamiliar, even threatening. The individual may withdraw further, confused by their own reaction. This resistance is not unwillingness to heal. It is loyalty to what once kept them safe. Silence has been a companion, a strategy, a form of self-care. Letting go of it feels like betrayal of the past self, and yet the cost of holding it becomes harder to ignore. The individual may notice patterns, relationships that never deepen, conversations that stay on the surface, a persistent sense of being misunderstood, not because others misunderstand, but because they are never fully shown. This awareness is painful. It raises a question the psyche has avoided. What has been sacrificed for acceptance? The answer is not immediate, but the question lingers, and with it a quiet realization begins to form. Silence may no longer be serving the same purpose. What once protected connection may now be preventing it. This realization does not arrive as clarity. It arrives as discomfort, as restlessness, as an unnamed desire for something different. This is the threshold, the moment before change. Not action, but awareness. The recognition that safety without authenticity is its own form of isolation. Awareness does not arrive suddenly. It does not announce itself. It gathers quietly through small moments that no longer feel neutral. A conversation ends and there is a familiar sense of relief, followed by something new. A hollow space, a feeling that something important was left unsaid. The individual begins to notice this pattern. Acceptance is present. Connection exists, but fulfillment does not. This awareness is unsettling. For a long time, silence felt like the solution. Now it feels incomplete. The realization is not that quiet is wrong. It is that quiet has become compulsory. There is a difference. Choice carries freedom. Compulsion carries cost. The individual may begin to notice how often they edit themselves, how quickly they defer, how instinctively they minimize their own reactions. Not with judgment, with curiosity. This curiosity is important. It marks a shift from identification to observation, from "this is who I am" to "this is what I do." Psychologically, this is the beginning of differentiation. The self begins to separate from learned behavior. The nervous system still responds with caution. The impulse to stay quiet remains strong, but now it is seen, and what is seen can be held differently. The awareness often deepens through emotional contrast. Moments of unexpected resonance stand out. Someone listens fully. A thought is shared without immediate self-correction. The response is gentle. Nothing bad happens. These moments are subtle but powerful. They challenge the old learning without force. The individual may feel surprised by their own relief, by how natural expression feels in the absence of threat, by how little disruption honesty creates. This does not erase fear, but it introduces doubt. Perhaps silence is not the only way to belong. Alongside this realization comes grief. Grief for all the moments that were filtered, for the versions of self that never entered the room, for the depth that remained hidden out of loyalty to safety. This grief is quiet but real. It is not self-pity. It is recognition. Recognition that acceptance was earned at a cost, and that cost was intimacy with the self. The individual may also feel anger, not outwardly but inwardly. Anger at the necessity of learning silence. Anger at environments that could not hold expression. Anger at the unfairness of having to adapt so early. This anger is not destructive. It is clarifying. It signals a boundary that was never allowed to form. Awareness allows this emotion to exist without action, without confrontation, without blame, just presence. Importantly, the moment of awareness does not demand change. It does not instruct the individual to speak more or to become louder. It simply asks a question. What happens if silence is no longer the default? This question does not need an answer yet. It opens a space.
In that space,
The individual begins to sense the difference between being accepted and being known. Acceptance feels stable. Being known feels alive. The two are not mutually exclusive, but silence once made them feel that way. Awareness loosens that belief. The individual may notice a subtle shift in posture, a breath that goes deeper, a thought that lingers a moment longer before being dismissed. These are not actions. They are permissions. Permission to notice, permission to feel, permission to consider another way of relating. The moment of awareness is not a turning point in behavior. It is a turning point in relationship with the self. Silence is no longer invisible. It is seen as something that formed for a reason. And in seeing that reason, the individual gains something they did not have before. Choice. Healing in this context does not mean becoming different. It does not mean undoing quiet. It means changing the relationship with it. Integration begins when silence is no longer treated as an identity, but as a response that once made sense. The individual starts to hold their history with compassion, not asking why they stayed quiet for so long, but acknowledging that staying quiet worked. It kept connection intact. It reduced risk. It allowed survival within emotional limits that were not of their choosing. This reframing is essential. Without it, any movement toward expression feels like self-betrayal. With it, expression becomes an extension of care rather than a rejection of the past. Psychologically, integration involves nervous system recalibration. The body has learned that expression equals danger. That learning cannot be reasoned away. It must be gently contradicted through experience, not dramatic experiences. Small, safe ones. Moments where a thought is shared without immediate editing, where a feeling is named without apology, where presence is allowed without performance. When these moments are met with neutrality, or even warmth, the nervous system updates its expectations. Nothing collapses. Connection remains. This does not happen all at once. It happens gradually. The individual may still feel the impulse to retract, to soften, to withdraw mid-sentence. Integration allows these impulses to exist without obedience. Silence becomes optional. Emotionally, something shifts. Instead of asking, "Is this safe to say?" the individual begins to sense, "Is this true for me?" Truth becomes a quieter guide than fear. This does not lead to oversharing or sudden boldness. It leads to congruence. Expression becomes aligned with internal experience. Not excessive, not restrained, but proportionate. The psyche relaxes when inner and outer worlds begin to resemble each other. This alignment reduces internal pressure. Emotions no longer have to circulate endlessly without release. They find reflection, context, relational grounding. As a result, emotional intensity often softens on its own. What once felt overwhelming internally becomes manageable when shared appropriately. Integration also involves redefining acceptance. The individual begins to notice that some forms of acceptance were conditional, dependent on self-minimization, and that other forms, quieter, deeper, exist. These forms of acceptance do not require silence. They are not disrupted by honesty. They are strengthened by it. This realization reshapes relationships. Some connections deepen. Others remain surface level. A few may loosen. This is not loss. It is differentiation. The individual is no longer present only as what others can comfortably receive. They are present as who they are. Importantly, quiet does not disappear. It becomes intentional. There are still moments when silence feels right, when listening is nourishing, when observation brings clarity. The difference is agency. Quiet is no longer used to disappear. It is used to be present. This distinction changes everything. Internally, self-trust begins to form. The individual learns that they can sense when expression matters, when it carries weight, when it deserves space. They are no longer silencing themselves preemptively. They are choosing when and how to speak. This choice restores dignity. Integration is not about volume. It is about ownership, owning one's inner life enough to let parts of it exist beyond the self. Owning one's voice without forcing it into places it does not belong. The nervous system learns a new equation. Expression does not automatically threaten connection, and silence does not guarantee it. Both are tools. Neither is identity. As this learning settles, the individual feels something subtle but profound. Relief. Not the relief of being heard constantly, but the relief of no longer holding everything alone. Quiet was never the enemy. It was never emptiness. It was never weakness. It was a response to a world that asked for less, and a self that learned to give it. In reimagining quiet, the individual no longer sees it as absence, but as space. A space that can hold reflection without erasure, presence without performance, stillness without disappearance. Silence, when chosen, carries weight. It listens deeply. It notices what others miss. It allows meaning to form before words arrive. But silence, when required, erases edges. It flattens complexity. It asks a person to become easier than they are. The difference between the two is not volume. It is consent. The individual who once learned to stay quiet to be accepted now understands something essential. Acceptance that requires self-reduction is not connection. It is tolerance. True connection does not ask for disappearance. It allows room for pauses, room for emotion, room for truth that arrives imperfectly. In this understanding, quiet returns to its rightful place, not as armor, not as a test, but as one expression among many. The individual no longer measures their worth by how little they disturb. They no longer equate being loved with being manageable. They recognize that their inner life was never too much. It was simply waiting for a place that could hold it. This recognition does not lead to loudness. It leads to grounding. A grounded presence does not need to announce itself. It does not need to justify its existence. It speaks when it matters, and remains silent when silence is true. The quiet that once protected now becomes a companion, no longer fused with fear, no longer tied to belonging. It exists alongside voice, not in place of it. This is not a transformation that others always notice. There may be no dramatic shift, no sudden confidence, but internally something fundamental has changed. The self is no longer hidden from itself. Thoughts are allowed to rise without immediate dismissal. Emotions are permitted to be felt without immediate containment. Expression is no longer a negotiation with safety. It is a response to truth. The individual understands now that acceptance gained through silence was never false. It was incomplete. And completeness does not require more sound. It requires alignment. Alignment between what is felt and what is allowed to exist. Between who one is internally and who one is willing to be externally. In this alignment, quiet becomes spacious rather than restrictive, a place to return to, not a place to hide. The story does not end with a voice raised. It ends with a self restored, present, whole, unafraid of being heard, and no longer afraid of being seen.